Okay, welcome. I think we are ready to get started. My name is Chelsea Payne. I'm the Director of Urban Design and Planning at Ascent. And we have been hired to help the city of Sunnyvale with this housing element update. My colleague, Kim Untermoser, and I will be delivering the presentation tonight. Before we begin, I want to make sure anyone needing language interpretation is able to access those services. We have interpreters here tonight providing Spanish and Mandarin interpretation. I'm going to go over those instructions in English and then have our interpreters provide those same instructions in Mandarin and Spanish. So to listen to the Spanish or Mandarin audio, look at the bottom of your screen in the control bar. On the right-hand side, there will be a globe icon labeled Interpretation. You're going to click this option and choose either Spanish or Chinese. To mute the English audio, choose Mute Original Audio. Our interpreters are going to be providing simultaneous interpretation tonight. In addition, we have translated versions of the PowerPoint available on the project website, and we will drop a link to the project website into the chat at the bottom of the screen. Now, Lee, if you could provide those instructions in Mandarin.
大家好，今天晚上欢迎大家来参加我们今天晚上 Sunnyvale 的住房更新要素的会议。我是 Chelsea， 我是住房开发部的那个工作人员，我会跟 Kim 一起，我们会一起给大家做这个会议介绍。那么我们现在呢，就是我们有翻译，如果你们需要语言翻译的话，你可以在你的就是电脑视频的下边有一个interpretation， 就是有一个翻译键，你可以点击那个键，然后呢去选择语言，你可以选择中文。如果呢你想静音原来的那个音频的话，就是英文音频的话，你可以就是按静音那个就把它静音下来，就只听到中文就可以了。那么也有书面翻译的就是那个词篇来介绍我们今天会议的主要内容，我们会发布在网站上，然后您可以进行查阅和了解今天会议的主要内容。谢谢。
All right, thank you, Lee. Johara, if you could provide those directions in Spanish, please.
Buenas tardes, bienvenidos nuevamente. Mi nombre es Chelsea Payne y soy la directora de planeamiento de Ascent en Sunnyvale. Yo seré la presentadora esta noche en este seminario de la actualización del componente de vivienda, y para aquellos que necesiten interpretación en diferentes idiomas, por favor sigan las instrucciones. Si es que ven en sus computadoras, para los que están utilizando computadoras, en el botón de la derecha, pueden hacer un clic donde dice interpretación, seleccionan el idioma al que necesitan escuchar, y es opcional que ustedes se pongan en silencio para poder escuchar mejor el audio original y así escuchar la interpretación en español. Para aquellos que están utilizando teléfonos inteligentes, hagan un clic en más y luego otro en interpretación de idioma, y después escogen el idioma, y es opcional que también se pongan en silencio. La interpretación a continuación, cuando empiece este seminario, será simultánea.
All right, thank you. We'll give everyone just a minute to access those language channels. And thank you all for your patience tonight. All right, so I think I'm ready to get started. Let's move to the agenda slide, please. Okay, wonderful. So just last week, the city published the draft housing element. And the purpose of tonight's meeting is to describe what's in the draft housing element and to start to gather feedback from the community. So in tonight's presentation, we're going to provide a brief overview of the housing element, talk about some recent trends in our housing needs assessment and the fair housing assessment. And then we're going to do a dive into the site's inventory and how the city aims to meet its housing needs. Then we're going to discuss the policies and programs included in the draft housing element. We are going to have some breaks throughout for some polling questions where we want to hear from you, our audience members. And then at the very end, we will have a Q&A session and an opportunity for discussion. All right, great, next slide, please. So I'll start by providing a brief overview of the housing element process and the state's requirements for housing element updates. The housing element is an element or a chapter of the city's general plan. It looks at housing needs in the city, and it's a policy document that guides the city's actions related to housing development, programs, and services. While the element focuses on meeting the housing needs of existing city residents, it's also the city's plan for how it will accommodate its fair share of the future regional housing need. Every city and county in California is required to have a housing element and to update it every 8 years according to a state mandated schedule. The adoption deadline for Sunnyvale and for all the other cities and counties in the Bay Area is January 31st, 2023. Unlike other elements of the general plan, there are very detailed requirements in state law for what has to be addressed in the housing element. The housing element is also the only element that's reviewed and certified by the state for compliance with state law. And the Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD, is the state department that's responsible for that review. The city's draft housing element that was published last week covers all of the topics and the content required by state law. Chapter 1 is the introduction. It describes the purpose and the organization of the housing element, and it summarizes the community engagement efforts leading up to the draft housing element. Chapter 2 is the housing plan. Now, this is really the heart of the document. It contains the goals, policies, and the implementation programs for how the city will address its housing needs. Chapter 3, the housing needs assessment, contains a lot of demographic data to describe the housing needs of city residents. And this includes residents with low incomes, seniors, people with disabilities, people experiencing homelessness, and other residents that have special housing needs. Chapter 4 meets the new state law requirement to prepare a fair housing assessment. And the fair housing assessment contains very detailed analysis to describe fair housing issues that are present in Sunnyvale. It looks at trends related to housing discrimination, patterns of residential segregation based on race and income, displacement risk, and access to opportunities. Chapter 5 contains the city's sites inventory. This chapter describes the city's housing target called the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or RHNA, and contains a detailed inventory of the land within the city where there's opportunity for housing to be built in order to meet the RHNA. Chapter 6 analyzes potential constraints to housing in an effort to try to reduce barriers to housing production. Chapter 7 describes the opportunities for energy conservation, and Chapter 8 contains an evaluation of the effectiveness of the programs in the existing housing element. And then lastly, the draft element includes 2 appendices that provide a more detailed summary of community engagement and a glossary that defines the terms we use in the document. I'm going to now highlight some of the key findings from different sections of the housing element, starting with the housing needs assessment. The housing needs assessment includes an analysis of growth trends within the city and within the region. And Sunnyvale is the second largest city in the county behind San Jose. Sunnyvale's population is expected to grow by 48% between 2020 and 2040, making it the fastest growing city in the county. Jobs are also expected to grow, but at a lesser rate of 18% between 2020 and 2040. Most Sunnyvale residents are between the ages of 25 and 44. However, the senior population over 65 has increased significantly over the past decade. Seniors saw a 22% change, while the number of middle-aged residents only increased by about 16%. And this trend is projected to continue throughout the planning period for this housing element as more baby boomers reach retirement age. Until recently, detached single-family homes made up the largest proportion of the city's housing stock, with over 21,000 detached single-family homes. However, since 2010, the majority of new construction in Sunnyvale has been multifamily housing in larger apartment buildings. As of 2020, multifamily housing now makes up the majority of the housing stock in the city. Mobile homes are also an important part of the city's housing stock, making up more than 6% of homes. As we all know, housing costs in California, and particularly in the Silicon Valley, are some of the highest housing costs in the country. As of December 2018, the median sale price for single-family homes in Sunnyvale was $1.8 million. These housing costs in Sunnyvale are generally comparable to costs within the region. You can see Sunnyvale highlighted here in green on the chart. It takes an income of about $370,000 for a sale price of $1.8 million to be considered affordable. About 27% of all Sunnyvale households are paying more than 30% of their income on housing, which is considered unaffordable. About 12% of all households are severely overpaying, meaning they're spending more than 50% of their income on housing. Overpayment is higher for renter households compared to owner households. 33% of renters in Sunnyvale are overpaying for housing, 15% of which are severely overpaying, while 25% of owners are overpaying. The housing element looks at housing needs of certain special needs groups that are identified in state law. Extremely low-income households are one of these groups. Extremely low-income households are those with an annual household income less than around $50,000 a year. And they make up 12% of households in Sunnyvale, but they have some of the greatest housing needs. 74% of extremely low-income households are severely cost-burdened, meaning they spend more than half of their income on housing. Seniors 65 and older are another special needs group, and as I mentioned, they're one of the fastest growing segments of the population. Countywide, the senior population is projected to nearly double by 2040. People with disabilities also have special housing needs. They often need housing that is specially designed to accommodate their disabilities, or they require more intensive support services. In Sunnyvale, 6% of the population has a disability. Most of these residents live at home rather than in an institutional setting. In the housing element, we also consider the needs of people experiencing homelessness. The latest point in time homeless count, which was conducted in 2019, estimated that 624 people were experiencing homelessness in Sunnyvale, including 147 unsheltered individuals. The 2019 count saw a 147% increase from the prior count of 2017. The pandemic has further impacted the homeless population, and we should soon be getting the results from the recent 2022 point in time count, and we will be including those findings in the housing element once they're available. One of the most significant new requirements for this housing element update is the requirement to address fair housing. Assembly Bill 686 is a new law that requires all public agencies in California to administer housing and community development programs in a way that affirmatively furthers fair housing. This means taking meaningful action to combat discrimination, overcome patterns of segregation, and foster inclusive communities where everyone has equal access to opportunities. The Fair Housing Assessment looks at local and regional settlement patterns related to race and ethnicity. In Sunnyvale, since 2010, the white non-Hispanic population has decreased from 46% of the population to 31% in 2019, whereas the Asian Pacific Islander population has increased from 32% to 47%. The city has a much larger Asian population compared to the Bay Area, and smaller populations of white, Hispanic, Latinx, and Black African American residents. This map shows the majority racial or ethnic group by census tract in Sunnyvale. The city limits are shown as a black dotted outline, and neighborhood planning areas are outlined in orange. Most census tracts within the city have either an Asian or a white majority population, either a slim or sizable majority. There are a few census tracts in the West and East Murphy neighborhoods that have a Hispanic majority. You'll also see the northernmost census tract where the Moffett Park specific plan area is located, and also a small square of city limits on the eastern edge of the city, that's within the Lawrence Station plan area, that are showing a sizable Hispanic majority. It's important to note that these areas are within much larger census tracts that are mostly outside of the city limits. There are currently no Sunnyvale residents in these areas of the city, so the demographic data that's represented on this map for those areas is from people that are living in other jurisdictions, either San Jose or Santa Clara. And that's a theme that needs to be just kept in mind as you look at these fair housing maps. Looking at income, we see that Sunnyvale has a higher percentage of households making above the area median income, 61% of households, compared to the county and the Bay Area as a whole. And conversely, Sunnyvale has a lower percentage of households in the lower income categories. Looking at patterns of income distribution within Sunnyvale, households in the southern neighborhoods of Sunnyvale generally earn higher incomes than households in northern Sunnyvale. On this map, the darker the blue, the higher the median income for that census block group. There's a correlation between the areas of the city with a majority Hispanic population and areas with lower incomes. Access to opportunity is one of the key things we look at in the Fair Housing Assessment. Access to opportunity refers to geographic access to goods, resources, and services that offer individuals the best chance at economic advancement, high educational attainment, and good physical and mental health.
Really bad. Okay. I think there's a bathroom.
Just gonna wait for that to clear up. The state has created a statewide map that classifies every census tract across the state into different opportunity areas. The high and highest resource areas that are shown in dark blue have the highest scores in terms of educational, economic, and environmental outcomes. You can see that in Sunnyvale, most of these highest and high opportunity areas are south of the Caltrain line, whereas most of the northern portion of the city is classified as moderate resource. The areas on the map that are classified as low resource are those same census tracts I mentioned just a minute ago as being primarily outside of the city limits. And again, there aren't currently any residents living in these areas of Sunnyvale that are showing up as low resource on the map. The Fair Housing Assessment also looks at displacement risk. Areas considered vulnerable to displacement in Sunnyvale are shown in purple. While these areas are identified throughout the city, we see slightly higher vulnerability to displacement near downtown and in census tracts containing the mobile home parks. Displacement risk of mobile home parks has been an area of focus for the city, and the city has many tools in place to preserve mobile home parks. At the end of the fair housing chapter, we summarize the key fair housing issues that we observed in Sunnyvale and the factors that have contributed to these issues. The first is an uneven settlement pattern based on income and race or ethnicity. We generally see wealthier and majority white neighborhoods in the southern part of the city and relatively lower income areas in the northern part of the city. The northern part of the city is the only area with census tracts that are majority Hispanic. Zoning is a contributing factor to this issue. The southern area of Sunnyvale is predominantly zoned single family, and single family homes tend to be more expensive, allowing relatively wealthier residents to live there. The northern part of the city has historically been where most of the city's industrial and employment land uses are located. It's also the older part of the city where most of the mobile home parks are. The city has more recently begun rezoning these employment areas to encourage more mixed use, allowing for higher density multifamily housing. And multifamily housing is generally more affordable than single family. So zoning plays a role in the distribution of incomes in the city. We also see some disparities in access to opportunity, with the highest resource areas in the southern part of the city and moderate resource areas in the north. These higher resource areas in the southern part of the city reflect the higher level investment in amenities like parks and schools. And the third key housing issue described in the Fair Housing Assessment is the risk of displacement. The biggest contributing factor to this displacement risk is the rapidly increasing housing costs in the city and within the region that create a high risk of displacement for lower income households. We're now going to pause the presentation to do some audience polling. We want to hear from you at this point. There are a couple of ways to access the poll. If we could go to the next slide. If you're in front of a computer, you can open up a web browser and type slido.com, and when prompted, enter the code that's shown here on the screen, 277639. You can also use your phone to scan the QR code that's shown on the screen. To scan the code, open up your phone camera, point it at the QR code on the computer screen, and a link should pop up that will bring you to the poll. And you can enter that same code shown here, 277639. So again, slido.com, code 277639. All right, so let's go to our first polling question of the evening. The first polling question is about the needs assessment and the fair housing assessment. We want to know, were there any findings that stood out to you as significant or surprising, and what were they? So this is an open-ended question. We'll give everyone a minute to type in some responses. All right, none. Okay, sounds like the data made sense and resonates. That's good to hear. Okay. Slightly surprised at the income needed to buy a medium-priced home and the increase in the senior population. Okay, great. Anything else that stood out as significant or surprising? The price of homes is currently closer to 2.1 million. Yeah, I believe that. The data we presented is a little old. Significant that we have 12% extremely low income households. And again, those are households generally making below $50,000 a year. None, possibly income level requirements, and population size overall is the second largest to San Jose. All right, great. Thank you for all this feedback. I know we had a lot of community members really anxious to be able to read the housing needs assessment. So hopefully there was some helpful data in there. The census tract is confusing, including San Jose and Santa Clara. Yes, we would agree. It makes the fair housing assessment a bit confusing. We've tried to explain that again, that those census tract demographics don't have anything to do with Sunnyvale population. Population growth may have slowed since 2019. Yeah, that would be worth looking into. Given the current price of homes, when homes are 4 million, who will buy them? Home prices are increasing very rapidly. All right, great, well, thank you. Thanks for sharing your thoughts, your observations. 33% of renters are cost burdened. Yes, that's right. Okay, well, I think we're next going to move into a presentation on the sites inventory, and my colleague Kim Untermoser is going to present this part of the presentation. So go ahead, Kim.
Hi, everyone. We can go ahead and move to the next slide. Okay, so in California, housing needs are assessed at a regional level based on projected population growth and other factors. A regional housing target or determination is assigned by the Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD, to each region, and then the regional government, so in this case, that's ABAG, or the Association of Bay Area Governments, then develops a methodology to distribute the regional housing needs to every jurisdiction. This process is called the RHNA. HCD assigned the ABAG region over 440,000 housing units to be accommodated over the roughly 8-year planning period. Based on the final methodology adopted by ABAG, Sunnyvale's portion of that regional housing need is just under 12,000 units. You can see here how this compares to other cities in Santa Clara County. Sunnyvale's RHNA is very similar to the cities of Santa Clara and Mountain View, and about double the RHNA for Palo Alto. This nearly 12,000 housing unit target is broken down by the income levels shown here. You can also see how the RHNA for this housing element compares to the city's current housing element RHNA, shown to the left. It's more than double the city's current RHNA, 119% increase. Several other Bay Area jurisdictions received a similar increase in their RHNA. The lower income RHNA, which is the very low and low income categories combined, is about 39% of the total RHNA. Very low income households include those that make up to $74,600 per year for a 3-person household. Low income households include those that make up to $106,000 per year for a 3-person household. These are the income categories that are typically the hardest to meet, so a lot of attention in the site's inventory is on how we're meeting the lower income RHNA. Ultimately, it isn't the city's job to actually build housing. The city has an obligation to plan for housing by making sure that it has the right zoning and infrastructure in place to provide adequate sites to accommodate the RHNA, and by including a suite of programs in the housing element to facilitate housing production. In order to inventory the city's capacity for housing development, we analyzed each of the city's plan areas and determined how many units can realistically be built during the 8-year housing element planning period. We identified capacity in the downtown specific plan, Moffett Park specific plan, Lawrence Station area plan, El Camino Real specific plan, and in the village centers. We also looked at sites outside of these areas that are designated for residential development in the land use and transportation element of the general plan. We then also projected the number of accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, that are expected to be built within the planning period. State law allows that the city count all sites that have zoning that allows for at least 30 units per acre towards meeting the lower income RHNA. We used this standard as a starting point in our analysis, but adjusted our assumptions based on the characteristics of the sites within the various plan areas. In general, we assume about 60% of capacity on high density sites meets the lower income RHNA, 15% meets the moderate income RHNA, and 25% meets the above moderate income RHNA. This assumes that the lower income units will be developed through the city's below market rate program, through density bonus, and through 100% affordable projects. The policies and programs in the housing element facilitate the production of affordable housing. I'm going to go through each of the areas now and summarize the capacity in our inventory. Note that several of the plan areas are still being prepared or are under review. This inventory is in draft form and will be revised appropriately as each of those plans is adopted. So first off, for the downtown specific plan, we reviewed all potentially developable sites to determine which sites would likely redevelop during the housing element planning period, based on the existing uses and conditions of the sites. The capacity identified in the inventory aligns with remaining capacity identified in the specific plan. The inventory includes 883 units in pipeline projects. Those are shown in blue on this map, and 302 units on underutilized sites included in the inventory. This includes 172 lower income units, 60 moderate income units, and 70 above moderate income units. The total capacity planned in the Lawrence Station area plan is nearly 6,000 units, but some of that capacity has already been built. In order to determine which of the remaining sites would be developed during the planning period, we reviewed zoning, existing uses, and received property owner and real estate broker input. In light of proposed projects and recent development patterns in the area, we calculated capacity based on an assumption that the sites will redevelop at 95% of the maximum density with incentives. The housing element inventory includes just over 1,000 units in the pipeline projects. Again, those are shown in light blue on the map, and 887 units on other sites shown in the shades of red. This includes 532 lower income units, 134 moderate income units, and 221 above moderate income units. The El Camino Real specific plan is one of the plans that's still in process. It's being updated by the city. So there may be many minor changes as the project moves forward, but we've reflected the sites in the inventory based on the current draft plan. Although it is anticipated that development in the plan area will also use incentives similar to the LSAP, we conservatively assume that sites would be developed at the base density without incentives. This is because the plan has not yet been adopted and there are no recent developments that we can look to identify trends. We identified sites that will most likely be redeveloped within the planning period based on the zoning, existing uses, and discussions with property owners during the plan update process. The inventory includes 706 units in the pipeline projects and 1,330 units on underutilized sites, including 684 lower income units, about 360 moderate income units, and 285 above moderate income units. The Moffett Park specific plan process is also currently underway. We've been coordinating closely with the team preparing the plan update to reflect the most current draft version in our housing element. Similar to the El Camino Real specific plan, we know that the plan may change over the coming months as the public and the council review the plan. Based on the current draft plan and our conversations with the project team, we've assumed projects will be built at 70% of maximum density in the residential zoning district, and that's shown here in yellow on the map. And then we assume that projects would be built at 25% of the maximum density in the mixed use zoning district, shown in orange, and at the minimum density in the activity center, shown in red on the map. These assumptions are based on development trends in the city and the specific zoning requirements of each district in the Moffett Park specific plan. We then identified the sites most likely to be developed for residential uses during the planning period, based on conversations with the project team and property owners. The housing element inventory identifies capacity for about 7,500 units and assumes about 4,500 of those units would meet the lower income need, and about 3,000 would meet the above moderate need. We have not identified any capacity for moderate income units based on guidance in recent state law regarding appropriate densities for the moderate income range. The land use and transportation element of the general plan designated shopping centers scattered throughout the city as village centers and promotes redevelopment of these centers into mixed-use nodes. We identified sites in the village centers based on zoning requirements and the existing uses. We calculated capacity based on an assumption that the sites will redevelop at 80% of the allowable density, or about 14 units per acre. Again, the inventory includes just under 200 units in pipeline projects and just over 700 moderate income units on underutilized sites. There are several other sites identified in the inventory that are designated for residential uses in the land use and transportation element of the general plan. These sites were selected based on existing uses and the potential for redevelopment. The inventory calculates capacity based on the assumption that development will build at 85% of the maximum density. The inventory includes about 500 units in pipeline projects and 578 units on underutilized sites, including 318 lower income units, 254 moderate income units, and 6 above moderate income units. Lastly, we also count in the inventory a projection of the number of accessory dwelling units that we expect to be built during the planning period. Since 2018, the city has issued permits for an average of 34 accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, per year. We project that that trend will continue. And so we project that forward over the 8-year planning period and apply affordability assumptions based on an analysis conducted by ABAG, or the Association of Area Governments. In all, we're counting 170 ADUs towards the RHNA, including 59 lower income ADUs, 85 moderate income ADUs, and 25 above moderate income ADUs. This table shows a summary of the draft sites inventory compared to the RHNA. The RHNA is shown on the top line, and the total capacity is shown near the bottom. The housing element sites inventory includes capacity for almost 15,000 total housing units, including 6,822 housing units in the lower income category. We've identified a surplus in all income categories. The city is required by state law to maintain sufficient capacity to meet the RHNA throughout the planning period. The housing element includes a program for the city to monitor its sites inventory and ensure sufficient capacity is maintained. As part of the Fair Housing Assessment, which Chelsea previously presented on, we analyze whether the site's inventory will improve or worsen the fair housing issues identified in the analysis. So we compare the location of sites to issues around income, access to opportunity, and displacement risk. This slide shows the site's inventory in comparison to median income levels in the city. As shown by the red bar in the chart, the majority of the city's housing element capacity is in areas with existing median household incomes of $87,000 to $200,000 per year, with about half in areas with median incomes of $87,000 to $100,000. The majority of the moderate income capacity is in areas with median incomes of $100,000 to $200,000 per year, while the majority of above moderate income and lower income capacity is identified in areas with median incomes of $87,000 to $100,000 per year. This map shows the sites identified in the inventory in comparison to the median income levels. 67% of the above moderate income capacity and 57% of the lower income capacity is identified in the very northern portion of the city in what is the Moffett Park specific plan. It's important to note, as Chelsea mentioned, that the census tract that encompasses the Moffett Park specific plan, as well as the census tract boundary that encompasses the eastern portion of the Lawrence Station area plan in the very eastern portion of the city, are much broader than Sunnyvale's city limits. They include neighborhoods in San Jose and Santa Clara, and there are currently no residents within these areas in Sunnyvale. So the demographic characteristics that are behind the median income levels are based on a population characteristics of the adjacent cities. It's anticipated that these trends will change as these areas develop. The moderate income capacity is scattered throughout the city and is primarily in areas with median incomes of $100,000 to $200,000. This is largely driven by capacity within the village centers. Next slide, thank you. This slide shows the location of the sites in the inventory in relation to the opportunity areas identified by the state. The high and highest resource areas are shown on the map in shades of blue, generally the Caltrain line, 33% of the site's inventory capacity is within these areas, including about 1/3 lower income capacity. Areas to the north are considered moderate, shown in teal, and low resource in light green. And again, note that the Moffett Park specific plan area and Lawrence Station area are both impacted by the census tracts that expand beyond the city limits. So when we see that 53% of our total capacity, shown in orange in the charts, and 69% of our lower income capacity, shown in light green, is in low resource areas, that's because so much of our inventory sites are within Moffett Park and Lawrence Station, where there aren't currently any residents. As these areas redevelop and amenities are built under the specific plans, these areas are expected to become areas of high resource. Lastly, we compare the site's inventory to the risk of displacement. About 3/4 of the inventory capacity is identified in areas not at risk of displacement. Only 1/4 of the inventory capacity is identified in areas considered to be vulnerable to displacement, including 55% of the moderate income capacity. These areas include locations in and around the downtown, areas near Highway 101 and Fair Oaks Avenue, and several of the village centers. The housing element includes programs to prevent displacement, including preservation of government-assisted housing, mobile home park preservation, and foreclosure prevention resources. So after that long presentation, we want to take another break and hear from you. There's a lot of information shared today, and we want to get your initial thoughts. Go ahead and open up slido.com again. If you need the access code again, it's shown here on the screen. It's 277639. And then we'll go ahead and move to the first question. So our first question is, what are your reactions to the site's inventory? We want to hear your thoughts on the location of sites, the calculated capacity, or any other reactions you have to the information shared. So again, this is an open-ended question. So go ahead and type your answers in. And you're welcome to type in more than one answer. So the first one is that they're impressed that we made the RENA all fit. And yes, the city, with these new specific plans that are coming in, they are really increasing the capacity for housing development. I'm hearing a lot of eggs being thrown in the Moffett Park specific plan area. Not sure if that aligns with AFFH. It's definitely something we're looking into. It makes sense that the greatest capacity is in Moffett Park, Lawrence Station, and El Camino Real. Again, those are the city's growth areas. Moffett Park is confusing considering the census tract. I do not understand any of the slides you presented. You went much too fast with too much data on each slide. It is a lot of information. There's more detail in the public draft housing element. Not matched plan in South Sunnyvale. Moffett Park plan assumes greater than 50% low income units, but the city only requires developers to build 15% below market rate units. What is assumed to greatly increase low income units? This will really depend on the programs that we include in the housing element. Interested in learning more about the ADU units. The percentage of lower income sites in Moffett and other high density areas seems way too high. Wishing to see more lower income sites at village centers. How did you determine a 60% building assumption? I'm concerned that Moffett Park is going to severely impact our jobs, businesses. This will impact our budget. I'm glad we're over planning for lower income units. We don't want to leave our vulnerable populations up to developer whims. We're getting a lot of feedback here. This is great. And this will all be recorded. Is it possible to go over some of the slides with lots of data? We will have a Q&A session at the end of this presentation where we can dive into more of your questions and bring things back up. I don't understand why above median income RENA numbers increase so much more than lower income RENA. Those are determinations made through ABAG. All right. Lots of interest in learning more about the ADU factors. The site's inventory needs to more clearly reflect how it'll address AFFH or fair housing. How can you accurately reflect opportunity in North Sunnyvale if no one lives there? So that'll be addressed through the Moffett Park specific plan update, which the city is currently preparing. It's anticipated for adoption later this year and will incentivize residential development in those areas. All right, we have another question, which some of you already alluded to. The second question is, do you have suggestions to further promote affordable housing in high resource areas? So share with us any ideas. I know many of you already mentioned the lack of lower income units in the village centers. We'd also love to hear if you have any ideas on how to promote production of affordable housing in these areas, how to increase resources in the lower resource areas. A dashboard for factors assessed in the displacement risk populations, especially in your schools, community resources. City to buy land in village centers for nonprofits. Those are both great things. Expand, reduce constraints to the voucher program. Why can't all areas become high resource areas? Why do we keep some areas as low resource? Those are determined by the state. That is through a more complex methodology that is based on census data. Identify more strip malls as village centers, increase village center minimum densities. I'd love to see affordable units in village centers, higher densities in village centers. These are all really helpful suggestions. Okay, we got one more: increased density of village centers, add shopping center at corner of Hollenbeck and Homestead. And again, increase incentives for an R3 zone block between Hollenbeck, Homestead, and Sunnyvale, Saratoga. Have lower parking minimums. Since the state now allows up to 4 units on formerly single family lots, perhaps there could be incentives offered by the city for converting single family lots into 4 units of lower income housing with design guidelines. And then we've got providing a live continuously updated count of progress towards RENA housing goals. Okay. And one more: work with small developers to convert single family homes to townhomes or row houses and pass the rent stabilization ordinance. Thank you everyone for your feedback. Really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Chelsea again. She's going to dive into our housing plan, which focuses on implementation programs that we have in the housing element.
All right, great. And I saw a lot of great questions in there as well. If you have questions that you'd like us to answer during the Q&A, please start putting them into the question and answers box at the bottom of the screen. And also when we get to Q&A, you can always raise your hand and ask your questions. So just wanted to prep you for that next part of our meeting tonight. But last but not least, I'm going to describe city's housing plan. This is chapter 2 of the housing element. I'm going to mostly focus on the key implementation programs that are included in the plan. The policies in the housing plan are organized around 6 goals: to provide adequate sites for new housing to meet Sunnyvale's housing needs, to assist in providing affordable housing for lower and moderate income households, to maintain and improve the existing housing stock, including preserving affordable units, to remove constraints to the production of housing, to promote equal housing opportunities for all residents, and to maintain quality neighborhoods. So the goals and policies make up the first half of the housing plan chapter, and the second half contains the implementation programs that I'm going to focus on next. Some of the key programs in the housing element to increase housing production include the 3 that are shown here. Program H2 addresses the fair housing issue related to access to opportunity. It calls for the city to identify capacity for an additional 100 units of high density housing in high resource areas in the southern part of the city. Program H3 is to facilitate new accessory dwelling units by creating an ADU toolkit that would provide assistance and resources for homeowners interested in adding an ADU to their property. Program H5 is focused on providing incentives, technical resources, and funding for new affordable housing development. The program includes language to prioritize sites in high opportunity areas and areas that are underserved by existing affordable units. The housing element includes many programs to preserve the existing stock of affordable housing, including H10 to assist in the acquisition and preservation of affordable multifamily housing. Program H11 reflects the city's obligation to track subsidized affordable housing and to make sure that property owners are providing at least 3 years notice if they intend to convert to market rate housing. Program H12 reflects the Mobile Home Park Memorandum of Understanding, which regulates rents at mobile home parks. This program also includes maintaining the current mobile home park zoning, which limits the ability for the parks to be developed with other uses. And program H13 is about providing resources to people facing foreclosure. There are a lot of programs in the housing element focused on addressing constraints to make it easier to build housing. This includes a program to review and modify the open space requirements for higher density residential units. Program H16 calls for reviewing development impact fees, which also includes considering whether a reduction in the park in lieu fee is appropriate. Program H18 is to develop clear and objective design standards for new residential development. Program H19 includes several amendments to the zoning code to ensure compliance with the latest state law requirements for different special needs housing types. So this program includes, among other things, allowing low barrier navigation centers, which are a type of homeless shelter, in all mixed use zones and non-residential zones where housing is allowed. That's a new requirement of state law. The program also includes expanding where group homes are allowed in the city. This is something that the state has been focused on during this housing element review. And then program H27 is a program to make sure the reasonable accommodation procedure. This is a process that allows people with disabilities to request exceptions to city rules to make sure that it's a clear and objective process. We've reviewed all the programs in the housing element through the lens of affirmatively furthering fair housing. But there are a few specific programs that I'm going to highlight that address fair housing specifically, including Program H20. This is about making sure that residents have information about their housing rights and that they know who to call if they encounter discrimination. This program is focused on making sure that that information is available in multiple languages. Program H23 is a program to establish a right to lease ordinance. This would require landlords to offer a minimum lease term, such as 6 months or a 1-year lease. The city is working on this ordinance right now, along with a relocation assistance ordinance, which is reflected in Program H25. And this would require landlords to provide financial assistance to tenants under certain circumstances in order to help them relocate. And then Program H34 is about prioritizing investments in areas of the city considered low or moderate resource to transform them into areas of opportunity. The program objective is to establish locations for a new library branch, park facilities, and a school site within low or moderate resource areas. Lastly, a few key programs addressing special needs housing include those that are shown here. Program 28 is about providing funding for those experiencing or at risk of homelessness. Program 29, realize that's not shown on the slide. Program 29 calls for working to establish a safe RV parking program for unhoused residents. Program 30 includes giving priority for city funding to affordable housing developments that include special needs housing units, like units for seniors, people with disabilities, or people with developmental disabilities. Programs 31 and 32 are about promoting age-friendly housing for seniors and a streamlined process for home renovations to help seniors age in place in their current homes. There are 35 programs in all included in the housing element, and that was a very quick summary of just 20 of the programs. We obviously didn't discuss them all tonight in the interest of time, but we're more than happy to dive deeper into the programs when we get into the Q&A in a minute. So if you have questions about specific programs, I'm more than happy to talk in more detail. But first, before we move into questions and discussion, we want to do our last 2 polling questions of the evening. The first question is, which programs do you think are the most effective programs in the housing element? Another way to think about this, which programs do you think are the most important and that you are glad to see included in the draft housing element? Review of development fees. Okay, great. Prioritizing city funding for projects that include special needs populations. Okay, great. What other programs do you think are most effective? Difficult to say until the completion dates are noted and the language reviewed. That's fair. Probably haven't had enough time to dive too deep. H23 and H25. Those were the programs around the right to lease ordinance and the relocation assistance, low barrier navigation centers and support for aging in place. H24, the best way to help the unhoused is to make sure they never lose the roof over their head. That's right, preventing homelessness. Safe RV parking, housing for very low income people with disabilities. Wish to have seen COPA in there. COPA is the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act. It's an ordinance that some jurisdictions in California are looking into adopting, and TOPA, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. Safe parking is a pleasant surprise, and the ADU toolkit. Okay. Any other thoughts on programs that you think are most effective? And I know you've only had a few days with the document. There's, of course, more time to review and provide feedback through the public review process. Seeing G35, we need to make sure low-income areas are receiving bike and ped infrastructure. Okay, we will note that. We need better job assistance and healthcare for the unhoused, not just housing. Absolutely. Okay. Well, we're going to move into the next question. Now, our next question is, are there additional programs or ideas that you would like to see the city consider? Anything we already heard some comments around the COPA and TOPA ordinances, bike and ped facilities in low resource areas. Any other thoughts on additional programs or ideas that you'd like to see reflected? Include the no net loss provisions currently outlined in SB 330 without a sunset date. Okay, we do have in there policy 3.8, but it does reference SB 330. 35 programs are a lot. I hope they all get implemented. Yes, Ryan and Jenny at the city and others are going to be very busy once this is adopted. Decrease parking minimums, okay. Mandate one-to-one replacement that also applies the same or deeper level of affordability as the housing units demolished. And I believe we do have a policy. You should look at policy 3.5 and see if that addresses your comment there. And if not, we'd love to hear more specific feedback. Displaced tenants should have the right of first refusal to rent new comparable units at the same rent as demolished units. Find a way to allow low-income residents to buy. Student-based housing support and navigation centers for seniors. Intergenerational and limited income resources at navigation centers with nonprofits overall. Set-asides for people with developmental disabilities in new developments. Okay, assistance with purchasing e-bikes so those living in new denser areas can easily navigate. Increase village center minimum density. Inclusionary zoning should apply to rental housing, waive all or some impact fees for 100% affordable projects. Include SB 35 provisions without a sunset date. This is great, very specific feedback, wonderful. If parking minimum is decreased, there needs to be checking that residents do not own cars and not just use streets as parking garages. Waiver for first and last month rent deposit, support funds, increase inclusionary percentage to 20. It's currently at 15%. We didn't talk too much about inclusionary housing tonight. That's one of the tools the city currently has in its toolbox to get affordable housing. End free street parking, prioritize deed restricted affordable housing on publicly owned land. Okay, great. All right. Okay, well, I think with that, we are ready to move into just our open questions and answers and discussion. So there are a couple of ways you can ask a question or make a comment. You can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen to type in your question, and we can, I see we're already providing some written answers through the questions and answers. You can also raise your hand. There's an option to raise your hand at the bottom of the screen. And then our Zoom host, Tracy, will unmute you, which will allow you to speak. We ask that you just keep your comments or your questions to a couple of minutes. There's also an option if you are calling in from the phone, which I don't know if, I guess we have one phone listener tonight. You can press *9 to indicate that you'd like to speak. And then you're going to listen for the message that the host would like you to unmute your microphone. And then you can press *6 to unmute, and then press *6 to remute. So if you want to raise your hand as well, again, *9 if you're calling in from a phone. But we have a couple of people that have raised their hands. So, all right. Jenny, I'm going to turn it over to you to help facilitate the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Chelsea. And Tracy, if you want to go ahead with our first question or speaker.
Sure. So first we have Chuck Fraley. Apologies, I might have pronounced your name incorrectly. Chuck, you should have an option to unmute yourself now.
Oh, hi, yeah, that was fine for the last name. It's Fraley. Yeah, when you're talking about the sites inventory, you had said that on the sites that are zoned for 30 units per acre or more, you determined that 60% of those would be developed in the lower income category. Can you talk about what analysis you did to determine that? It just seems a lot higher than a lot of the recent projects that have been going on. So I was wondering kind of what analysis was done to determine that 60%.
Sure, I'll let the Ascent team take that one. Kim or Chelsea?
Yeah, so I can answer that. And I know that's a bit confusing. There are a lot of assumptions that go into our sites inventory. State law has something that's called the default density standard for jurisdictions across the state. For Sunnyvale, the default density is 30 units per acre. And that's the density at which it's determined feasible for lower income housing to be built. So per state law, any site where the zoning allows 30 units per acre, we are allowed to inventory that as a lower income site. Now, usually we would just count that site as having 100% capacity towards meeting the lower income RHNA. That's historically how we've always done housing element sites inventories. We took a slightly different approach this time, partially to reflect slightly more realistic assumptions and not say 100% lower income. There's also a new law called AB 725. This requires that 25% of your moderate and above moderate income RHNA also be accommodated on higher density sites. So there's no real, the 60% was settled on sort of for the purpose of meeting that requirement of AB 725 while still recognizing that sites that are zoned at 30 units per acre per state law are identified as meeting the lower income RHNA. And Kim, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to clarify that anymore.
No, I think you explained that well.
So I know it's sort of just for the purpose of meeting all these requirements of state law.
Okay. Great, thanks. And Tracy, our next hand.
Right, so next we have Kenneth Rosales. Kenneth Rosales, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hey, good evening. Again, my name is Kenneth Rosales. I'm the planning senior associate with Silicon Valley at Home. As you may already know, we're an affordable housing advocacy organization based in Santa Clara County. And I just want to commend the staff for publishing this long-awaited draft of the housing element. We know how difficult and complicated this entire process has been and will be up until the end. So we just want to note that we're pleased to have more information to assess and review now. And I would look forward to providing comments and meeting with staff to discuss them. Thank you so much, and I'll yield my time.
Great, thank you very much, Kenneth. And I'll pop in here for one written question we have before our next hand. So the question is, are all 35 programs accounted for and included in terms of funding overall, or pending approval based upon further review? So that's a great question. So the City Council will consider the housing element with all 35 programs. They'll have the ability to add or modify or edit them before it goes to the state for consideration. But in general, we're considering all programs together to be implemented. Some are spaced out in various timeframes, as you can see the dates. And so, some might need more funding, so some might take longer to be implemented, but overall they'll be considered as a whole package, but implemented one at a time. Some might occur, with others. So we might be able to implement multiple 1 year and less another year, depending on how complex they are. But overall, the goal of staff will be to implement all of these programs throughout the next 8 years. And we'll take the next hand, Tracy.
Okay, next we have Agnes V.
Hi, thank you. Actually, Chuck asked the question I was going to ask, so I'm going to try another one, and I'm not sure if you can answer this at this time. Is there any discussion to change the density for the village centers to increase it?
Great question. I'll see if I can take that one. So city staff is basically just starting on the village center process. So it is still very much a work in progress. As of right now, there's no discussion about increasing the density. However, we would encourage you to be involved in that planning process through our planning division and voice any comments or concerns about the lack of density or increasing the density. So as of right now, there's not. I believe we might have included a policy or a program, and I can let Ascent speak to that. But in terms of the actual process, I highly encourage you to get involved with our with the Village Center project. Ascent, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yes, I was looking for the program number. Program H2. It's titled Increase Affordable Housing Opportunities in High Resource Areas. And the program is to identify additional capacity for high density residential in areas of high resource, such as the village centers south of El Camino and other areas in the southern part of the city. So the village centers is included as an example of an area that the city will consider for increased densities, but that might include other areas outside the village centers. But through this program, the city has would be making a commitment to identifying additional capacity for at least 100 lower income units.
Great, thanks, Chelsea. Tracy, we're ready for our next question.
Okay, next we have Kalisha Webster.
Hi, thank you. My name is Kalisha Webster. I'm Senior Housing Advocate at Housing Choices. We help people with developmental and other disabilities to find affordable housing. One question I had, I saw on your slides as well as in the actual draft housing element that when reporting on housing capacity, the table shows the very low income and the low income as one category as far as how many reporting of the housing capacity, whereas the HCD does require that you report those two categories separately, and that in fact very low income also should include around 50% of those should be also extremely low income. So I'm just curious as to why it was decided to report this all as one, and is there a way to find out the exact capacity for those different income groups?
Sure, thanks. Chelsea, do you mind taking that question?
Yeah, I can answer that. For the purpose of the sites inventory, we do group together the extremely low, very low, and low income RHNA into the category of lower income. That's solely for the purpose of inventorying the available sites, because there's really that 30 unit per acre default density doesn't distinguish between the different income levels. So if a site meets that density, we categorize it as generally a lower income site, meeting all of those income levels. But as the city reports on implementation every year to the state in their annual progress report, the city will report on actual units built at each of those individual income levels. So as projects get built, meeting extremely low, very low, low, they will get reported individually in the annual progress report. But just for the purpose of the sites inventory, we do group everything together.
Great, thank you very much. And the next hand, Tracy.
All right, next we have Julia Liu.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so this is a follow-up on Chuck Fraley's question. So Chelsea answered it really well. Okay, so the next step. So now, say a developer applies to develop some housing at Moffett Park, and they say 15% because that's what the affordable housing, because that's what the city ordinances is, right? Our inclusionary housing percentage. Would the planning commission approve that and says no, this is 60% low income housing area? I'm guessing that your answer would be the planning commission would not say that and would just say, yeah, 15%, that's our city ordinance, and let that through. Okay, so then the next step is, so when we do our annual reporting, our number's going to fall off, right? Because we own, where it was supposed to be 60% affordable housing, we only got 15%. And then what we do? Then what's the city going to do?
Thanks for your question, Julia. Chelsea, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. Yeah, Julia, that's a very well-informed question, and you explained pretty much exactly how that process works. So first of all, the assumption of 60% lower income is not a mandate or not a requirement that that site provide that many lower income units. The city's inclusionary ordinance is the only mandate for affordable housing. That 60% can't be used to deny a project. So if a project comes in on a lower income site and proposes fewer units at a different income, a higher income, that can't be grounds for denying a project. The city is required to track and to monitor the development on all of these lower income sites in the inventory. There's a law called no net loss that says the city has to maintain adequate capacity to meet its RHNA throughout the entire planning period. And if the city approves so much housing on the sites in the lower income inventory that at some point the city doesn't have enough remaining capacity to meet the remaining RHNA, the city would then have to identify additional sites to add into the lower income RHNA. There would essentially be a rezone obligation, or other sites could become available, through demolition or just existing uses. So there would be a requirement to find replacement sites. So right now, the city has about a 2,000 unit buffer in that lower income category. But as projects get approved that are market rate on some of those sites, that buffer was going to get sort of chipped away at. And it's possible that later in the planning period that the city may not have enough remaining capacity at some point later in the planning period. Hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Chelsea. And Tracy, do you have any more hands?
Yes. For those who have already spoken, if you don't have any additional questions, please lower your hands. I am going to call on the next person who has yet to speak. So that is Gail Rubino.
Okay, I'm going to follow up on Julia's question with two questions. The first is, why is the city listing these sites with the 60%, knowing that we're not going to get 60%? We're going to get 15%. Because especially, we know that because we've built so much stuff with the downtown plan that's been the inclusionary, and they even got 12%, not the 15%. So why are we sticking our neck out and saying it's going to be 60%? And especially on the El Camino Real specific plan, because we know that's going to be an eagerly snapped up portion of the city where I think that's going to be developed probably pretty quickly. And my fear is that it won't be more than 15%, which means it comes off the list and we just don't have that many other places for it to go. So that's first question. The second one is that we've got the village centers, I think at 18 units per acre. And I believe it's state law that says that you only have to have affordable units when it's 30 units per acre. So every village center that we have on the books is way below any inclusionary housing. So why are we even discussing affordable housing on the village centers? So those are my two questions. The first is, why are we doing it so high at 60%, especially on El Camino Real, when we know that's going to be snapped up like crazy? And two, the village centers at 18 per 18 units per acre, knowing that 30 is the limit where you can do inclusionary housing. Thanks. And I've read this report. It's really well done. You guys did a great job on it, but I think there's a few bullet holes in there.
Great, thank you very much, Gail. Chelsea, do you want to address Gail's questions?
Yeah, I will. I think I'll start with the comment or the question around the village centers and the 18 units per acre. So the city's inclusionary housing requirements apply to all new residential development, regardless of density. So lower density, higher density, there's no, the inclusionary requirements are not tied to that 30 unit per acre density. What the 30 unit per acre density is, it's a default density that says if the site is zoned to allow 30 units per acre, you can count it in your housing element towards your lower income RHNA. Because the village centers have an average density of 18 units per acre, we've counted all of that village center capacity towards the moderate income RHNA rather than the lower income RHNA, because state law doesn't allow us to count that density towards the lower income RHNA. But there still will be inclusionary requirements on projects built at those densities. And as lower income units are built, they would get credited towards the city's RHNA in the future. So I hope that clarifies that it doesn't exempt them from the city's inclusionary requirements. We just don't get to credit any of that capacity towards the lower income RHNA because of how state law is written. Getting back to the 60% lower income on the high density sites, and why did we not just go with 15%? The city has a very ambitious RHNA target, as do a lot of jurisdictions in the Bay Area. And the city is also mostly built out. There's really no vacant land from what the state considers vacant, raw vacant land in Sunnyvale or most cities in the Bay Area. And the way that the law is written, it is very challenging to count non-vacant sites. You have to provide a lot of evidence that those sites are available. It's a really tricky exercise to show how you're meeting the RHNA. law also allows you to count anything at 30 units per acre essentially as 100% meeting the lower income arena. So we haven't exactly followed that, taken that approach. We've been slightly more conservative from that perspective. But we do hear what you're saying about 60%, being higher than the city's 15% inclusionary. There are some projects that get built as 100% affordable, outside of the inclusionary. So the inclusionary is an important part of how affordable housing gets built in the city, but it's also not the only way that affordable housing gets built. And I don't know if anyone else at the city has anything to add to that.
I think you covered it well. Thank you very much.
Okay, next we have Justin Wang. Justin? You're unmuted. Justin?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Awesome. Sorry about that. I know I feel like I'm totally beating a dead horse here, but just to, really hone back in on the 60% thing. I understand what you said about, we do have 100% affordable projects, and that can kind of counteract it. But, those are pretty few and far between, and the unit counts for those are usually not that high, right? Like we had 1178 Sonora Court, Onozuka Crossing, and those are really just drops in the bucket relatively. And so I'd imagine, 60% is, it just seems really, really high. But I'm sure you've done your homework, right? So I'm just kind of curious, have you done like an assessment of how likely it is that we'll need to do this rezoning, that we'll have to go back to council? Because, I just imagine that would not be cheap, right? Like we'd have to spend more staff time, we'd have to maybe even bring on more consultants, it'd take up council time. Has there been an assessment done of basically likelihood to trigger rezoning after enough sites are taken off the table for affordability, and the potential costs that would have? And is that something that we'd consider presenting to council, from my perspective, to incentivize them to kind of increase that buffer of 2,000 units? I know we have that buffer. I'm just concerned that, over the course of the next 8 years, we're going to have to do this rezoning. And I just see that really taking up valuable time and resources from other projects. But yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Justin. Chelsea, was there anything you wanted to add on this topic?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit more. We haven't done an analysis that's sort of at what point we would expect a rezone to get triggered. It's pretty complicated. And in a lot of other areas of the inventory, we've tried to be conservative in our assumptions. For example, Moffett Park Specific Plan is potentially going to create capacity for up to 20,000 housing units, but we're coming nowhere near those numbers and what we're assuming in our inventory. Same with El Camino Real, we're being pretty conservative in the densities assumed there. And I think over time, we'll see how that area plays out. It may develop at higher densities than what we're assuming. So it doesn't mean that in the future, a rezone would necessarily be triggered. I think the city will have more information about actual densities that are being built and other sites that come online. So we've been conservative with what we add to the inventory based on the existing uses on the ground and the status of those sites today. But other sites could become available. Businesses could close down, sites could sell, exchange hands, become available for residential. So it's complicated and there are a lot of different layers of assumptions. That 60% lower income is one, but just all of the sort of the vetting we did of what sites we even include in the first place and the density, there's just a lot of layers of assumptions here. So I guess that's just to say, it's dynamic and it's changing, and there's going to be more information 2 years from now about what sites might be available and could be added to the inventory.
I just would love to say really quickly, I appreciate your patience with this. I know we asked that question a lot of times in different ways, and I know staff and the consultants have worked really hard on that. So thank you for your work.
Thank you. Okay, I know we're over on time. We were scheduled, I think, till 8 o'clock tonight. Is that right? But I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes, but we also understand if you need to sign off. But yeah, I think we can take a couple more questions if that works for city staff and others.
Yeah, Tracy, do we have any new hands? Maybe we just take one or two new hands.
Yes, Angela Roche.
Hi, good evening. Thank you. There's a lot of information here. I'm encouraged that this is a draft so that we can maybe make some adjustments as we go forward. And there's potential to improve some of the things that maybe got overlooked. I've read most of it, but not all of it. So maybe you could just speak a little to project-based vouchers, or Section 8. From what I understand, we have 199 units in Sunnyvale, and I believe there are over 1,000 people of interest on that list just for Sunnyvale. So, I mean, that seems to be concerning because we need more housing. So along Justin's comments, I really think we might have to just really increase density and go bold. And excited to hear how you guys feel about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Angela. I'll take the first part and then turn it over to Chelsea. So just as a reminder that the Housing Authority of the County of Santa Clara is who oversees the Housing Choice Voucher, the Section 8 program. So the city doesn't actually have any role in that program, but your point is fantastic that there is a significant amount of individuals on the list, and there's a significant need and demand for new affordable housing. So we have absolutely considered that, not only expanding outreach for landlords and encouraging more to take Section 8, but also looking at increasing our density in Sunnyvale to accommodate more affordable housing. Chelsea, anything you want to add to wrap that up?
No, I think that's it. Angela, we hear your comment about needing to increase density. So that comment has been noted. And I think others here voiced that as well.
Great, thank you. All right, so that is the end of our new hands, and we are about 10 minutes over. So Chelsea, I will turn it back to you to wrap us up and provide the public with any final thoughts.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jenny. So yes, after tonight's workshop, we have 3 other upcoming meetings on the housing element. We're going to be meeting with the Planning Commission on May 23rd, the Housing and Human Services Commission on May 25th, and then ultimately the City Council on June 21st. So at each of these meetings, we'll be presenting the draft housing element along with a summary of comments that we received from the community for consideration. Following the June 21st City Council meeting, we will be revising the draft housing element based on council direction, distributing it back to the public for a quick look, final review before we submit it to the state for their review. The state has 90 days for their first round of review and 60 days for each subsequent review. So we expect that process to take about 6 months. We'll be making revisions during that process. Anytime we revise the housing element and submit any revisions to the state, we will make those revisions public, notify anyone that's on our interest list. Our goal is to bring back a final revised housing element to the City Council for adoption prior to the January 31st, 2023 deadline. So, essentially the housing element is in draft form until it is adopted, which is targeted for next January. We would request that you submit comments prior to that June 21st council meeting to be able for us to consider your comments in this first draft. Because again, we're going to be revising it in late June and submitting to the state in early July. But the housing element will remain available for public review until it is adopted. So here are the links to those upcoming meetings and the dates, as well as a link to the city website where you can find a copy of the draft housing element. And also the email address is at the bottom lower right hand side of the screen for Ryan Dyson at the city. You can email your written comments to Ryan at rdyson@sunnyvale.ca.gov. So we encourage you all to spend more time reading the document, submitting your comments, and please attending these other meetings as well as an opportunity to provide more public comment. And with that, I think we can wrap up for the evening. So thank you all very much for your feedback, your great questions, and we look forward to receiving more feedback from you and working with you on revisions to the draft. Have a wonderful night.
Great, thanks. We're just going to leave the presentation up for a minute or two for people to be able to scan the QR codes, but there will be no new content. And in case you couldn't hear, the email to submit your comments is rdyson@sunnyvale.ca.gov.
All right, thanks, Tracy. Have a good night, everyone.